Hello everyone, my name is the Soul of the West, and today we'll be talking about the Glass-Steagall Act, how it works, and why it is so important. And so with that in mind, let's begin. Glass-Steagall was formally repealed in 1999 by the Gramm-Leach-Belay Act, which created the new classification of financial holding companies with the power to underwrite and sell insurance and securities, perform commercial and investment banking functions, invest and develop real estate, and engage in other related activities. This gave the speculative side of these new financial institutions access to the deposit base of the commercial banking side, turning bank deposits into fuel for the derivatives parasite. The derivative bubble is what blew up the system, bankrupted the U.S. banks, and devastated most of what remains of the productive capacity of the U.S. economy. The term Glass-Steagall Standard refers both to the official act of 1933, which created a legal firewall between commercial banking and speculative investment banking, and to its founding principles. Glass-Steagall was one of the single most important reforms initiated by FDR, designed to break the grip of the Anglo-American financiers led by J.P. Morgan over our nation's economy. Commercial banking is a public trust and a necessary component of a healthy economy. Citizens deposit funds at a bank, and the bank uses them to make loans to other citizens for the purpose of improving the standard of living to their communities. Bankers have a responsibility to protect these funds and lend them wisely, but the money belongs to the depositors, and banks are merely custodians. For the system to function properly, these depository institutions must be highly regulated, provided with a clear framework of what is and what is not permissible. Banking regulators must closely watch each bank to make sure those rules are followed and promptly corrected by any violations. The Glass-Steagall Standard allows and protects only these legitimate deposit and commercial banking functions necessary to a healthy and productive economy. Because the powers of Glass-Steagall were eroded and even ignored for years before the formal 1999 repeal, the speculative and commercial aspects of our financial system are heavily commingled, and the process of separating what is legitimate and necessary from the highly inflated speculative values could be a lengthy process. Without government protection, however, the illegitimate banking functions would have disappeared into bankruptcy long ago, and without the commitment by the U.S. government to protect and honor speculative debts, they will dry up. Additional measures can be taken in the interim to outlaw derivatives, which would solve the problem of having to wind down all of the fictitious claims they represent. The restoration and the enforcement of the Glass-Steagall Standard is the single most important first step to setting our economy on a road to recovery. So there's another aspect to this, which is the Angelides Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission report, and that is a report that was looked at to why the financial crisis happened in 2007 and 2008, and its findings are that we need to reintroduce the Glass-Steagall Act in order to save the United States. How did it come to pass that in 2008 our nation was forced to choose between two stark and painful alternatives? Either risk the collapse of our financial system and economy, or commit trillions of taxpayer dollars to rescue major corporations and our financial markets as millions of Americans still lost their jobs, their savings, and their homes. The Commission concluded that this crisis was avoidable and found widespread failures in financial regulation, dramatic breakdowns in corporate governance, excessive borrowing, and risk-taking by households and Wall Street, policymakers who were ill-prepared for the crisis, and systemic breaches in accountability and ethics at all levels. Here we present what we found so that way everybody can reach their own conclusions. even as the comprehensive historical record of this crisis continues to be written. Conclusions of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. One such person who was part of this commission wrote, "I've long stated that our current market crash was caused by lending industry taking advantage of government deregulation intended to make home ownership available to more Americans. And a classic example of the law of unintended consequences, the deregulation allowed lenders to sell virtually any loan they created, regardless of whether or not the borrower was qualified for the loan. This house of cards eventually crashed when original teaser rates reset and millions of borrowers could no longer afford the loans. In 2008, Congress created a commission to investigate the cause of the crash and appointed Sacramentan Phil Angelides to head it. In a blistering report that followed 18 months of testimony and fact-gathering, Angelides and his Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission blamed a wide cast of characters for the epic meltdown, including executives of insurance giant AIG and Goldman Sachs, and government policymakers like Alan Greenspan, Timothy Geithner, and Ben Bernanke. The report said human error created the crisis. The report blamed mortgage lenders for the flood of risky subprime loans that ignored a borrower's ability to pay. Wall Street investment banks recklessly packaged the loans into toxic securities that exposed the entire financial system to meltdown, and the report concludes. The panel held 4 field hearings, all in communities that were among the hardest hit by the real estate crash: Sacramento, Las Vegas, Bakersfield, and Miami. In Sacramento, commissioners heard about the Central Valley's vulnerability to housing price bubble. One witness testified that appraisers were pressured by lenders to make inflated appraisals so shaky loans would go through. The financial report mentions Sacramento numerous times, noting that housing prices more than doubled in a 5-year stretch. All the while, government watchdogs were asleep. For more than 30 years, lawmakers and presidents bought into the free market ethic, backed by the likes of Greenspan, the former Federal Reserve chairman. The sentries were not at their posts, the report said. However, following the release of the report, government officials lost no time in getting to finger-pointing. The Crisis Commission's findings were caught up in immediate partisan bickering. While the report was endorsed by the 6 Democrats on the commission, the 4 Republicans refused to sign off on its conclusions. At the press conference introducing the report, Mr. Angelides made no bones about where he stood on this question. This was an avoidable crisis, he said bluntly. As the report puts it, the crisis was the result of human action and inaction, not of Mother Nature or computer models gone haywire. If only regulators had been willing to regulate. If only Wall Street had done proper due diligence on the mortgages it was securitizing, if only subprime companies had acted more honorably, if only the credit rating agencies had said no when asked to slap AAA ratings on subprime junk. If only, if only, if only. Now comes the real test of whether our leaders will put back in place the economic regulations necessary to prevent irresponsible lending while not stopping the economic recovery, which is just beginning. We need to have a thriving lending system for our nation to continue to grow and prosper, but that lending system owes a duty to us all to act reasonably and responsibly, a duty sadly lacking in causing this market crash. And assigning responsibility for the 2007-2008 financial collapse, the final report of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission places crucial emphasis on banking deregulation and particularly the erosion and repeal of Franklin Roosevelt's Glass-Steagall Act. The Commission's mandate from Congress did not include making recommendations for resolving the current crisis and preventing a future one. But economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche has identified the restoration of Glass-Steagall, which was repealed in 1999, as the critical and essential condition for halting the present collapse and beginning to rebuild our economy. Chapter 2, Part 2 of the FCIC report, entitled Setting the Stage, chronicles the rise of what it calls the shadow banking system of investment banks, money market funds, and hot money, parallel to the commercial banking system, and shows indisputably how deregulation allowed the shadow banking system to grow and outstrip the regulated banks to the point of their collapse in 2007 and 2008. The report cites as pivotal the 1933 passage of the Glass-Steagall Act, with its establishment of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, intended to protect depositors' monies, prevent bank panics, and to discourage excessive risk-taking in the banking system. But as the shadow banking system grew in the 1970s and 1980s, the commercial banks argued they had been trapped in a straitjacket since the 1930s by Glass-Steagall, which strictly limited their participation in the speculative securities markets. The FCIC report documents the step-by-step drive for deregulation in the 1980s and 1990s, justified by arguments for unlimited competition and innovation, typified by the argument put forward by Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan that unfettered markets create a degree of wealth that fosters a more civilized existence. That's fucking hilarious coming from him, since he's head of a central bank known as the Federal Reserve, which has a monopoly on the creation of all money. So, hypocrisy much. But anyway, beginning in 1987, the FCIC report states the Federal Reserve accommodated a series of requests from the banks to undertake activities forbidden by Glass-Steagall. The movement continued to dismantle the regulations that restricted depository institutions' activities in the capital markets. In 1991, the Treasury Department issued an extensive study calling for the elimination of the old regulatory framework for banks, including the removal of all geographic restrictions on banking and the repeal of Glass-Steagall Act. Chapter 4 recounts the events of the 1990s when the parallel banking system was booming. Commercial banks were acting more like investment banks, and the largest banks were pressing regulators, state legislators, and Congress to remove almost all remaining regulation, especially that which separated commercial banks from security firms and insurance companies. In 1998, Citicorp forced the issue of Glass-Steagall repeal with its merger with Travelers Insurance Company to form Citigroup, and the next year Congress compliantly passed the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, lifting most of the remaining Glass-Steagall restrictions. The FCIC cites a New York Times report that Citigroup's Sandy's Will hung a plaque in his office with his portrait and the caption, "Shatterer of Glass-Steagall." The biggest bank holding companies became major players in investment banking, says the Angelides report. The strategies of the largest commercial banks and their holding companies came to more resemble the strategies of investment banks, and it went on until predictably it blew up in 2007. Both of the dissenting FCIC reports, coming from the 4 Republican members of the 10-person commission, singled out the mention of Glass-Steagall, explicitly denying that the repeal of Glass-Steagall was a cause of the crisis. Peter Wallison, who for years has been the leading Wall Street propagandist for deregulation, accuses the Commission's majority of only looking for facts to support their assumptions about deregulation, greed and recklessness on Wall Street, etc., and he then declares outstandingly that no significant deregulation of financial institutions occurred in the last 30 years. The repeal of a portion of the Glass-Steagall Act, frequently cited as an example of deregulation, had no role in the financial crisis. Wollaston's entire tedious, lying, almost 100-page argument is that the sole cause of the crisis was the federal government's housing policy, which encouraged poor people to buy houses they couldn't afford, exemplified by the role of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the Community Reinvestment Act. Wollaston's argument was too much for even the other 3 Republicans on the commission, who were not so sweeping in their dismissal of the majority's analysis, but who nonetheless assert that neither the Community Reinvestment Act nor removal of the Glass-Steagall firewall was a significant cause. These arguments dismissing the crucial role of the repeal of the Glass-Steagall and other financial deregulation have been repeated incessantly and lyingly by Wall Street apologists since the release of the truthful and irrefutable Angelides report. Now, something that's not talked about at all in any of this that I have been going over, some of it I've read, some of it just came from my own knowledge about what's going on, is the fact that we wouldn't even need anything like Glass-Steagall at all if we didn't have the Federal Reserve banking system in place. I will be doing a video on that at some point in the future, how it works and why it is such a deplorable system and all of the problems that it has caused, not just the American people, but in all countries around the world that have a similar central banking type of system. Anyway, since the removal of the Federal Reserve probably isn't going to happen anytime soon, the best bet that America has for getting back on track and for having an economy that actually works really well is to have Glass-Steagall be brought back. I am someone who is completely for free markets, which is why I don't want a Federal Reserve central bank in any way, shape, or form. But if we have to have one, then I want it regulated, and I want it to where there's separation of it because it worked. It worked for a very long time, and it helped protect huge crashes from happening. It was only after its removal and only after the deregulation of it that the derivatives and the stealing of people's money led to the crash of 2007 and 2008, as well as the crash that happened in 1999 and 2000. So this is Glass-Steagall works when we have Federal Reserve banking system in place, and it is necessary when we have a Federal Reserve banking system in place. But if there was no Federal Reserve banking system in place, Glass-Steagall would not need to, possibly not need to exist at all. I'll have to do more research into whether that would actually be true or not from other historical examples and stuff. Anyway, thanks everybody so much for listening and to watching the video. I hope you learned something about it, about the crash of 2007 and 2008. And why Glass-Steagall is so important and how it can help prevent huge market crashes in the future.